As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the weekly report. Facebook files reveal despicable disregard for the Constitution. Last week's revelation that Facebook took orders from the Biden administration to censor even accurate information about COVID is the latest example of the U.S. government's disregard for our Constitution. Thanks to Representative Jim Jordan, chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, we now know the extent to which the Biden administration went in its proxy war against the First Amendment. Getting the information wasn't easy. It was only after Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg was threatened with being held in contempt of Congress that he relented and shared information with the Judiciary Committee about Biden administration pressure to censor Americans on Facebook who disagreed with White House policy on COVID. What we have discovered thus far is disgusting. For example, in April 2021, a Facebook employee sent a message to top executives in the company explaining that we are facing continued pressure from external stakeholders, including the Biden White House, to remove posts. In another example, senior executive Nick Clegg complained that Andy Slavitt, a senior advisor to President Biden, was outraged that if Facebook did not remove a particular post, according to Representative Jordan's report. Representative Jordan revealed that the offending post that the Biden administration wanted removed was simply a joke making fun of possible vaccine injury down the road. The Biden administration even wanted to protect us from jokes that it didn't like. The administration did not stop at targeting what is called misinformation. As constitutional law professor Jonathan Turley noted in a recent column, the administration also demanded the removal of malinformation that is based on fact, but used out of context to mislead, harm, or manipulate. So the Biden administration wanted to cancel even truthful information counter to its own preferred narrative. This level of contempt for our Constitution is shocking. As Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who was himself censored at the behest of the Biden administration, testified recently before Congress, a government that can censor its critics has license for every atrocity. It is the beginning of totalitarianism. Who knows how many thousands of Facebook accounts were banned or restricted at the behest of the Biden administration. Early last year, I received notice that my own Facebook page was restricted for 90 days because I pointed out that the CEO of Pfizer once claimed that his COVID shot was 100% effective, but later changed his story. The post was completely accurate, but still, my page was targeted. Although some are using this information for partisan gain against the Democrats in power, Americans should not delude themselves. Left unchecked, there is little reason to believe a Republican administration would show any more respect for the Constitution than the Biden administration. Both parties have shown themselves to be selective in their pledged oath to uphold and defend the U.S. Constitution. It is just as unconstitutional and thus illegal for the U.S. government to violate the First Amendment by proxy through so-called private companies, as if the government directly attacked our freedom of speech. We must remember that the unprecedented U.S. government censorship of Americans during COVID was just the test run. Be assured that when the next crisis comes, and it will, the authoritarians in charge will again ramp up the censorship machine unless we do something about it. Thanks for listening.
So Mexico's President Andrés Manuel López Obrador said Monday that his country would attend talks on Ukraine that are set to be held in Saudi Arabia this weekend only if Russia is invited. He said, quote, "If there's acceptance from both Ukraine and Russia to look for solutions to achieve peace, we'll participate. We don't want the Russia-Ukraine war to continue. It's very irrational. The only thing that benefits from it is the war industry." End quote. So while this is being billed as peace talks, Russia has not been invited to the summit in Saudi Arabia. Nations that are not aligned with the US and NATO on the war have been invited, including India, Brazil, and China, but it's not clear at this point which countries will attend. They invited about 30 nations to attend this summit. And the idea here is for Ukraine and its Western backers to use the summit to try and convince non-aligned nations to adopt Kiev's demands for peace, which include a full Russian withdrawal from all the territory that's been captured, and that is currently a non-starter for negotiations with Moscow. Ukraine is also demanding that Russia cede Crimea, which has been controlled by Moscow since 2014, and is populated by people who are happy that they are part of the Russian Federation. For their part, Russia insists that any future peace deal must recognize the territory it has annexed in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, and that demonstrates how far apart these two sides are when it comes to peace talks. So in an op-ed published by Newsweek, former President Donald Trump said that the Russiagate conspiracy was a coup attempt that led to the war in Ukraine. Trump warned the Russophobia hysteria created by the conspiracy theory could start World War III. Trump said, quote, "An unelected cabal in the senior ranks of our government, in concert with their chosen candidate, Hillary Clinton, and their allies in the media, launched the de facto coup attempt known as the Russia hoax. Their goal was to prevent my election, and failing that, to throw me out of office or sabotage my presidency, undercut my agenda in Congress, block my domestic reforms, and interfere with my foreign policy," end quote. Trump references the report compiled by John Durham that vindicates his claim that Russiagate was a conspiracy invented by his political opposition. Another Trump claim, bolstered by the Durham report, is that the American intelligence community wrongfully pursued the investigation into ties between his campaign and the Kremlin. Trump identified that the conspiracy theory impacted Russia policy. He said, quote, "At a critical moment when we should have been reducing tensions with Russia, the Russia hoax stoked mass hysteria that helped drive Russia straight into the arms of China. Instead of having a better relationship with Russia as I worked to build, we now have a proxy war with Russia, fueled in part by the lingering fumes of Russiagate delirium," end quote. So Kyle explains that Trump is seeking to solely blame those who pushed the Russiagate hoax for the destruction of U.S. relations. But as president, Trump took a very aggressive stance against Moscow, and certainly Russiagate has a lot to do with that. He was definitely under pressure to be hawkish toward Russia, but it's we can't forget that he was very hawkish toward Russia, tearing up major arms control treaties, the INF and Open Skies. He was the first one to send missiles to Ukraine, so there was already, a proxy war going on at a much smaller scale. So we can't forget that history. But it's going to be an interesting election season. I mean, I don't know. Things are going to get pretty crazy, I think. But just when it comes to the back and forth about the war in Ukraine, because right now it seems like Trump is the front runner for the Republicans. So it's going to be interesting. The U.S. wants a multinational force to intervene in Haiti. So there's another one from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute. Washington plans to introduce a resolution at the United Nations Security Council to authorize sending soldiers to Haiti. The Caribbean country has fallen into chaos after President Jovenel Moise was assassinated over 2 years ago. The White House has been seeking a country to lead the multinational force for months and appears to have enlisted Kenya to serve that role. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller said that the U.S. and Ecuador planned to introduce the resolution at the Security Council to authorize the deployment in the coming days. Miller indicated that more steps need to be taken before Kenyan troops arrive in Haiti. He said, quote, "The second step is that the government of Kenya needs to conduct an assessment mission, which they plan to do in the coming days and weeks. We are committed to finding the resources to support this multinational force," end quote. So Washington has spent several months seeking a country to send their soldiers to Haiti. In October, American officials wanted Canada to take on the role, but Ottawa rejected Washington's demands. So Kenya leading the mission could pose an issue, as its soldiers are known to commit human rights abuses. Foreign intervention in Haiti has a very, very dark history. There was a very chaotic UN intervention, and UN, what they call peacekeepers, lots of rights abuses, lots of rape and things like that. So just a really dark history. And from how I understand it, the people of Haiti don't want, foreign intervention. They definitely want an end to a lot of the violence that's happening. But, again, just this dark history of U.S. and UN intervention there. I mentioned here, I always have to put this in from Nick Terse over at The Intercept, just explaining, the complete failure that U.S. counterterrorism policy has been in Africa. In 2002 and 2003, the U.S. Counted just 9 terrorist attacks in all of Africa. And last year, just in a few countries in the West Africa there was 2,737 terrorist attacks. Complete and utter failure. But the U.S. does not want to leave, so that's why I wouldn't be surprised if they really back some sort of military intervention. This is from Gallup, and it's based on a Gallup poll. Americans are now less likely to express a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in the U.S. military, with a noticeable decline that has persisted for the past 5 years. The latest numbers are from a June 1st to 22nd Gallup poll that also captured record lows in public confidence in several public institutions. So if you see this chart here, this is U.S. confidence in the military. and it shot up in the 90s, and shot up, after 9/11, then went down and up, and now it's been steadily declining for the past 5 years or so. So at 60%, confidence in the military was last this low in 1997, and it hasn't been lower since 1988, when 58% were confident. 60% still seems kind of high to me. But yeah, I just thought that was interesting. So if you want to go check out the details of that poll.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
But as far as threats, what we do know from the Twitter files is that the government was making threats. We also know this from the depositions in Missouri versus Biden. The threats were, if you don't do this, there may be antitrust action against you. These were overt threats, and this is what's going to make this case so strong. When this gets to the Supreme Court, I think that the free speech advocates are going to win. This is a lawsuit began by Senator Eric Schmidt when he was the Attorney General. But I think the evidence is pretty strong that there were threats. There were threats of antitrust action against the companies if they didn't take the material down. There was also threats of, we will remove your 230 protection. Section 230 gives them liability protection, and they were overt threats and threats in writing, basically saying, if you don't take this down, your 230 protection of liability.
We're going to pause it there. You guys can go watch the rest of this if you're interested. I think it's pretty clear what happened over the last couple of years and the amount of censorship that exists in the social media platforms. I think it's pretty clear. We even heard Jen Psaki. She said it live on TV that they were, I forget the exact turn of phrase, but that they were talking to social media companies. We heard Mark Zuckerberg, when he was on the Joe Rogan podcast, describe, oh yeah, we felt pressure to act in a certain way. I think it's pretty obvious. And I think we know that what government will do. If you're in business and you've got the ability to pressure people to only put out the good information about you, you're always going to do that. And so if you're the person with the monopoly on violence and you're the most powerful player in the game and you're running your business and you've got certain policy agendas that are good for your business, such as pretending like the money you're spending is actually helping everyone, pretending like the inflation is just temporary, pretending like you have no control over the oil prices, I mean, you're just walking towards dictatorship. And so we can all understand that obviously you don't want to give that kind of power to government. This just makes sense. But then you get the people who will pretend like the implication that government would abuse its power is unproven. But that's exactly what the issue is if you allow government to be snaky and apply intimidation without actually breaking the law of wink, wink, nod, nod. Hey, we'd really appreciate if you did this. We all know what does that mean when the government calls you up and goes, hey, we'd really appreciate if you did this. It obviously means that they're probably going to make your life a little bit more difficult if you don't oblige them. And it will be a lot easier if you do oblige them. Well, I don't think Sam Bankman-Fried has gotten totally off, but for some reason, and we're working off headlines more than usual on this episode, but there's good information here, everybody. And feel free to go fact check me. And you probably aren't even aware of these stories. Now you can go Google them. So you're welcome. I just helped you out. But he's being let off for, I guess, the campaign donation fraud, which sounds like a good way to make sure that the politicians are uninvolved in any of these investigations and get to keep the money. Like all the other stuff's on the table, but the thing that kind of included that a lot of the money went to the politicians and might have been stolen money, well, you're not guilty on that one because then we might be guilty of taking the funds. So, why don't we look into all the other bad stuff that you did? Trying to describe Ron DeSantis and why I think he's a deep state character. And that's in part because of the time he spent in Gitmo. And I was very bold because I'd been having a conversation the night before with Scott Horton where, I'd laid out my theory. And that's the problem. Like Scott, he actually knows all this information. You can talk to Scott. He knows all of it. He knows all of it. And then you get emboldened because you were just hanging out with him and he knows all of it. And then you realize, well, he's not sitting right here. Oh, I'm not prepared for this conversation at all. And then the conversation that was on Bill Maher about this is why we need a domestic terrorism title. And I see an organization that is willing, not just willing, I see them as like another branch of the news. I'm not talking about the entire FBI, but there's some unit in the FBI that goes, hey, we need news stories that showcases the threats that we're claiming exist so that we can have the budget to go police those threats. And if they could, I've said this before, people like me would probably be in jail. Hey, that's a domestic terrorist with no rights, and they've been spreading misinformation that would get in the way of us being able to create more news stories and trap more people and then have budget to go police more like-minded individuals. So here you go, the actual receipts, because otherwise this just sounds like stupid conspiracy theories. Judge orders release of 3 of Newburgh 4 criticizing FBI. Judge Colleen McMahon of U.S. District Court suggested that the federal agency had invented a conspiracy. A federal judge on Thursday ordered the compassionate release of 3 Hudson Valley men who were part of a group known as the Newburgh 4 after finding that the FBI agents had used an unscrupulous operative to persuade them to join a plot to blow up synagogues and bring down military planes more than a decade ago. The decision by Judge Colleen McMahon of United States District Court in Manhattan was scathing in its description of the methods used by the FBI in its pursuit of the 3 Onta Williams, LaGarde Payne, and David Williams, calling the plot in which they were convicted of participating in 2010 an FBI-orchestrated conspiracy. A person reading the crimes and conviction in this case would be left with the impression that the offending defendants were sophisticated international terrorists committed to jihad against the United States, Judge McMahon wrote. However, they were in actual reality hapless, easily manipulated, and penurious, I don't know that word, petty criminals. Under the judge's orders, Onta Williams, David Williams, and Mr. Payne's sentences will be reduced to time served plus 90 days. They were sentenced in 2011 to at least 25 years in prison. During the trial, a fourth defendant, James Cormity, was presented as being a key player in the plot, though Judge McMahon seemed most aggrieved by Saeed Hussein, a longtime FBI informant. He later became infamous as the owner of a down-market limousine company that rented a defective vehicle to a group of partygoers in 2018, leading to 20 deaths. In the Newberg case, this last paragraph I'll read. You guys can read the rest of this on your own. Judge McMahon wrote that Mr. Hussein, whom Sheen described as a most unsavory, had lured Mr. Cormite in 2007 with promises of both heavenly and earthly rewards, including as much as $250,000 if he would plan and participate and find others to participate in a jihadist mission. After waffling for months, Mr. Cormite recruited the other three defendants, though none had any history as terrorists, instead were impoverished small-time grifters and drug users / street-level dealers who could use some money. The three men were recruited so that Cormite could conspire with someone, she wrote. The real lead conspirator was the United States. Last paragraph. Their plan, encouraged and orchestrated by Mr. Hussein, was to bomb Jewish sites in the Bronx and fire Stinger missiles at military planes at Stewart Airport near Newburgh, New York. Bombs were in fact left outside two synagogues in the Riverdale section of the Bronx, but they were fakes built by the FBI. And I remember this. I remember when the story came out. I'd be like, holy shit, the FBI, they stopped people that were going to bomb synagogues. Holy shit, this thing is real. Maybe I don't remember that. I'm just saying that now because it's convenient while I'm reading the article. But there you go. This was something I talked about more than once. And then remember a couple weeks ago when I said, keep your retarded kids away from the FBI because he had that kid that they had send them like $25 as if he was going to go to ISIS. And then he called the FBI to try and rat out the FBI for trying to recruit people. And then he ended up getting sentenced to jail time. So this has been a long running conspiracy theory of mine that the government will in fact, I'm sorry, I get distracted. And Nibs is funny. He said, I'm going to email Rob and tell him I'm gay. I can respect that. This has been a long-running conspiracy theory of mine that the government will, specifically the FBI, create its own news so that, you know, it can pretend that threats exist and then strip us of our freedoms in order to police those threats that it was able to create news about to say existed. And here, to me, New York Times, federal judge seems to confirm that at least in that story, and the truth always comes out when it's too late. Once they get their agenda passed and it's irrelevant, that's when the truth comes out. That's why when whatever the fuck they were doing and trying to police terrorism in the United States of America, trying to push for tapping phone lines and whatnot, now that it's irrelevant, the truth can come out and these people don't have to sit in jail anymore. But as long as it's still relevant information, oh, we're going to need 57 years before we can release any of the COVID data. Sure, we can get it approved in 2 months, but to share that data, it would take 57 years to share all that data.
Well, I think there's two major forms of slavery in this country. When the government makes the assumption that they own every penny you earn and you're allowed to keep the amount that they want you to keep under their conditions, I call that about as close to economic slavery as you can get. But that's not the one I want to talk about. It was a different type of slavery that's been around for, thousands of years probably. And I have a family story that was told that my grandfather left Germany when he was 14 and came over here by himself. Yikes. And the whispers in the family was he was escaping the draft. So
good for him.
Maybe that's where I got some of those instincts. But this whole thing about the reinstituting the draft, I think is a form of slavery. And I made some major decisions in my life on what training I would have and what I would do. Always back into my mind, I would be drafted. And so when I got drafted, it seems like, well, I knew it was coming, even though there was a period of time, in the 70s after people got sick of the Vietnam War, the people were reacting, and for a couple years, we didn't have the draft. We didn't even have the registration until 1979 and 1980. The effort was made to renew the registration, which I always thought was foolish and it made no sense whatsoever. Why would you do it unless you want to enslave these people? And it really is one of the most discriminatory events of our government. They worry about equity and fairness and civil liberties, but how can you have it without, you don't need 10 million people in the military. You need to pick and choose. And up until now, it's always been that when they've had drafts, the minority suffered the most for various reasons. They suffered the most. But right now, they're talking about it again because of the market saying to young people, what do you want to get into into the military.
Yeah.
You know, there's been a decrease in enthusiasm for the military. Interesting enough, there's records now that surprisingly, even the support coming from the hawkish type of Republican Party has been greatly reduced. It went down like 20 points in the last couple of years. So that is telling us something, that there's something wrong, and it isn't Vietnam going on right now, and even the tragedy of the Mideast wars going on, and even the tragedy of us being involved in precipitating and pursuing war in Syria and in Ukraine. That's not it. There's something else going on, and of course we want to talk about that. But we came across an article that talks a lot about it. A military person who comes up with the decision. It disappeared in military.com. We need a limited military. No sweat. It's limited. They're not going to draft you, Daniel, so don't worry about it. This is bad news for the concept of liberty. I think it should be attacked on basic principle of whose life is it anyway, and make sure that people at least hear the principles. It's not your life if the government has total economic control of every penny you earn, and what you can do at certain times, and set up all the rules, and that family members and individuals and everybody is vulnerable. The whole system is vulnerable to people being, susceptible to the government coming and say, we need you to go.
And the Biden administration is without a doubt, with support of Republicans, as you would say, is pursuing a conflict with Russia and China simultaneously. There's going to be a real need. And so here's more of the rationale of this Lieutenant Colonel. And again, I say it's going to resonate with a lot of people. Do this next one because it's all practical. It's all about, actually go back one. It's all about practical. Here's what he said. Here's what his model, the hybrid model, if you can rewind just one, please. He said, okay, it's going to alleviate the incredible pressure on recruiters. It's going to lower the cost of finding new troops. And significantly, this is the one part that's interesting, Dr. Paul, significantly reduce the much decried civilian military gap by subjecting all of America's youth, rich and poor, to the possibility of service in the draft. So he's saying, we're going to get rid of the poverty draft. We're going to have rich kids going to, as well as poor kids, and that'll make it more even. We're going to save a lot of money. And not only that, if you put the next one on, it's going to save money, it's going to ease up our recruiters, it's going to even up the gap between the rich and the poor, and it might also have the added effect of increasing public pressure to prevent open-ended wars led by unaccountable senior leaders. So you have all of this, but wait, there's more, one more, and you mentioned it earlier on, Dr. Paul. It's going to do all those wonderful things, and it's going to, the establishment of an all-volunteer force also drove the military to expend an incredible amount of resources in terms of manpower and dollars to build a recruiting machine. So it's going to save all this money of the recruiting machine, considering it costs, as you mentioned earlier, $15,000 to recruit each new member, and the overall cost each year exceeds $2 billion for recruiting. Save money, prevent wars, do all these wonderful things. I don't know, Dr. Paul, he's doing a hard sell here.
You know, along with what you were just saying here, it would increase public pressure to prevent open-ended wars led by unaccountable senior leaders. You know, they said the draft is going to prevent those kind of wars, which doesn't make any sense. Because what do they not talk about? What we talk about here about 90% of the time when we're on foreign policy, mind our own business, come home, and defend this country. But no, they have all this. This is fancy, and like you say, his strategy of what, and he knows to whom he's speaking. You know, the American people. And this sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
This sounds.
It's a compromise.
You can still be patriotic. Matter of fact, he wants people to feel more patriotic because they've worked out a disagreement, and coming together to defend this country. Yet it's the conflicts in the country. Why are we involved? In the Middle East and right now in Ukraine? It has to do not because we don't have a draft. It's because we've drafted the American people to work and slave and cough up a lot of money for us to build weapons to enrich the military-industrial complex. That's the part they don't want to touch. Not once does he mention that kind of material. Yeah. And we can throw our weight around, we can cut people off, we can put on sanctions. These, I've always argued that, if we had some of these boycotts placed against us, what if China would ever do that to us, and had 20 ships in the Gulf of Mexico to prove that it's, it's a free lane, and they have a right to be there. That would be different. But we're an empire on decline, and of course, what's up for grabs is what's going to replace it. Yeah. You see, I don't think they can stop the decline of the empire. It happens throughout all history. All the empires disappear, and it's always be overextension overseas and over authoritarianism to do this, taxes or whatever, and people finally get disgusted with it. And the big question is, what will replace it? And I think that's where we have advanced, with civilization over the last several hundred years. I mean, there's so much technology that has been advanced, but it's so often used for the military and used for the power of the dictators, where the technology should be used, for promoting a free society. And that is the challenge, and that's where I hope I'm right, that there is progress being made in those areas.
Yeah.